The human body contains 206 bones. Thomas Hale learned this not from any book, but from counting. By the spring of 1847, he had counted the bones of 17 people, some intact, others scattered by time in the Georgia soil, that tried but failed to keep its secrets. On the evening of March 11th, 1847, a stranger arrived at Belmonte Plantation, carrying a leather satchel and a letter bearing a wax seal that had already been broken and poorly resealed. The overseer, Mr. Dalton, brought the man directly to the main house without the usual interrogation at the front gate. Thomas was trimming the hedges near the entrance when he saw them pass. The stranger walked with the gait of someone who had traveled far, but his boots showed only a day's worth of dust. This inconsistency made Thomas's hands still on the shears. The stranger identified himself as Mr. Edmund Voss, a lawyer from Savannah, though his accent carried notes of somewhere farther north. He explained to Colonel William Fairburn, regarding a matter of inheritance and property dispute involving land that adjoined Belmont's eastern boundary. The colonel received him in the study, and Thomas, assigned to serve refreshments, heard fragments of their conversation through the partially open door. The deceased left no clear will, Voss was saying, but there are irregularities in the land transfer of 1839. Questions about how the property was acquired. Colonel Fairburn's response was measured, controlled. I purchased that land legally, Mr. Voss. Every document was properly filed. Of course. However, the deceased nephew is contesting. He suggests there may have been undue influence in the sale. The previous owner, Mr. Gerard Finch, died quite suddenly after the transaction. Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he poured water into the crystal glass. He knew the name Gerard Finch. He knew exactly where Gerard Finch was buried. Later that evening, after Voss had been given a room in the house, and the colonel had retired, Thomas stood in the doorway of his cabin in the quarters, looking out at the expanse of Belmont. The plantation stretched across 200 acres of Georgia cotton country, with the main fields visible even in the darkness of vast emptiness under the stars. But Thomas wasn't looking at the fields. His eyes traced invisible lines across the landscape, marking locations that only he could see. 17 points on an invisible map that he carried in his mind. The first grave he discovered was an accident. He'd been 12 years old, newly purchased, and brought to Belmonte from an auction in Augusta. His mother hadn't come with him. They'd been separated, and the not knowing her fate had carved a hollow place inside his chest that never quite filled in. That first grave was beneath an old magnolia tree on the far edge of property, where the cultivated land gave way to forest. He'd been digging fence post holes. They often made the new slaves do the hardest physical labor, testing them when his shovel struck something that wasn't rock or root. He'd uncover the remains carefully, quietly, then cover them again. Even at 12, he'd understood that finding a hidden grave meant danger. It meant someone had buried something they wanted hidden. But what haunted him wasn't the grave itself. It was the iron ring he'd found among the bones. A key ring with 7 keys, corroded but intact. He'd kept it hidden in a tin box beneath the floorboard of his cabin. He didn't know why. Perhaps because it was the first real choice he'd made since arriving at Belmonte, to keep something that belonged to the dead. Thomas was 31 years old in the spring of 1847, though the plantation records listed his age incorrectly as 28. Such small inaccuracies were common. Slaves' birthdays were rarely remembered or recorded with precision. He had lived at Belmont for 19 years, longer than any other enslaved person currently on the property. This longevity was unusual, and Thomas understood suspicious in its own right. Belmonte had a reputation for high turnover. Slaves were frequently sold south, the explanation given whenever someone disappeared. Sold south meant the deeper plantations of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, places spoken of in whispers as the furthest ring of hell. But Thomas had learned that not everyone who left Belmonte was sold anywhere at all. The second grave he'd found was 5 years after first. He'd been 17, assigned to drainage work after heavy rains had flooded the lower fields. The water had caused erosion near a drainage ditch, and there, exposed in the eroded bank, was a human skull. He'd worked quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, reburying the remains deeper, covering the site with stones and brush. But he'd noticed something crucial. The skull showed a distinct fracture pattern, the kind that came from a deliberate blow. After that, he'd started looking, not obviously, not in any way that would draw attention, but with the careful observation of someone who understood that knowledge was the only form of power available to him. When assigned to repair fencing, he noted disturbed soil. When working in the forest, collecting firewood, he marked unusual depressions in the earth. When helping with construction projects, he paid attention to places where the ground had been dug and refilled. By 1847, he had found 17 graves, 17 places where someone had been buried in secret, away from any church or marked cemetery, 17 people who had vanished from the record of the living without proper account. He remembered names. Sarah. She'd been a house servant who'd witnessed something in the colonel's study. She'd disappeared in 1842, allegedly sold to a trader heading to Mobile. Thomas found her remains near the old stable that had been torn down in 1843. Marcus, accused of theft, taken to the whipping post, but Thomas never saw him afterward. They said he'd run. Thomas found him beneath what was now the new tobacco barn, built in 1839. The foundation had been laid directly over disturbed earth. Eliza, she'd worked in the colonel's wife's chambers. Mrs. Fairburn had died of fever in 1840, and Eliza had tended her in those final days. 3 weeks after the funeral, Eliza was gone. Sold south was the explanation. Thomas found her in the woods, half a mile beyond the eastern property line. And Gerard Finch, not a slave, but the white landowner whose property the colonel had acquired. His was the easiest to locate because Thomas had been part of the work crew that had rebuilt the old spring house on the absorbed property. They'd been instructed to dig deep for the new foundation. Thomas had understood even then what they were really digging. Now Edmund Voss had arrived asking questions about Gerard Finch and the land sale of 1839. This was dangerous in a way Thomas couldn't fully articulate. Secrets buried for 8 years were being exhumed. On the second day of Voss's visit, Thomas was assigned to attend the lawyer during his survey of the eastern property boundary. The colonel insisted that Voss be accompanied ostensibly for safety, but Thomas understood it was for surveillance. Colonel Fairburn wanted to know exactly what Voss was looking for and where he was looking. They walked the boundary line, Voss consulting surveyor's documents and occasionally stopping to take measurements with brass compass and chain. Thomas carried the lawyer's satchel and surveying tools, staying 3 paces behind, as was expected. "You've been at Belmont a long time," Voss said suddenly, not turning around. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes, sir. You knew the previous owner of this section, Mr. Finch." Thomas chose his words carefully. "I seen him sometimes, sir, when he was alive." "What manner of man was he?" "I couldn't say, sir. I didn't know him for speaking to." Voss stopped walking and turned to face Thomas directly. His eyes were sharp, analytical. The property records show that Mr. Finch sold his land to Colonel Fairburn in July of 1839, then died 3 weeks later in a riding accident. Rather unfortunate timing. Thomas kept his expression neutral, his gaze somewhere just past Voss's left shoulder. "I wouldn't know about that, sir." "No, I suppose you wouldn't." Voss resumed walking, but Thomas caught something in his tone, a suggestion that the lawyer knew more than he was stating. They reached the old spring house, the one that had been rebuilt in 1839. It sat partially collapsed now, and used since a newer spring house had been constructed closer to the main house. Voss examined it with interest, walking around the perimeter, noting the foundation. This was rebuilt the same year as the land transfer, Voss observed. Curious that they'd rebuild this rather than simply construct the new spring house they ended up building anyway. As Thomas said nothing, his heart had begun to beat faster, though he kept his breathing steady. Voss knelt near the foundation, running his hand over the stones. Deep foundation for such a small structure, very deep. For a moment, Thomas thought Voss was about to start digging, but instead the lawyer stood, brushed off his hands, and continued walking the boundary. Thomas followed, gripping the satchel tighter than necessary. That evening, Thomas sought out Isaiah, one of the oldest enslaved men on the plantation. Isaiah was in his 60s, partially blind in one eye from an old injury, and he'd been at Belmonte even longer than Thomas, though just Barely. He'd arrived in 1826, 2 years before Thomas. They spoke quietly in the space between Isaiah's cabin and the water barrel, where conversations could be disguised as the ordinary interaction of fetching water. You remember when they built that new spring house on the Finch property? Thomas asked, his voice low. Isaiah's good I fixed on him. The old one or the new one? The one they rebuilt in 39, then abandoned. Isaiah was silent for a long moment. I remember. You remember anything else from that time? I remember Mr. Finch came to visit the colonel. They had a disagreement. Loud voices in the study. Then, Mr. Finch didn't come anymore. You remember who worked on rebuilding that spring house? Isaiah's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eye. Some of those men aren't here anymore. Thomas, you asking questions that have answers you might not want. I'm trying to understand what's happening. What's happening is what always happens. White men have disputes. Other people disappear. The earth gets dug, then covered. And we keep living because we don't ask about what's under the dirt. Thomas absorbed this. The lawyer who's here. I seen him. And I seen how the colonel watches him. That man is digging up more than land boundaries. Thomas, be careful you're not standing too close when something collapses. The opportunity came on the third evening. Colonel Fairburn had invited Voss to join him for supper, and afterward they retired to the study for brandy and cigars. Thomas was serving, essentially invisible, as he moved around the room, refilling glasses and tending the fire. Voss had brought his satchel into the study, setting it beside his chair. As the evening wore on and the brandy flowed, the conversation became more pointed. I'll be frank with you, Colonel. Voss said, my client believes that his uncle was coerced into selling the land. There are witnesses who say Mr. Finch never intended to sell. Witnesses. The colonel's tone was dangerous. What witnesses? People who knew Mr. Finch. People who say he visited Belmonte to discuss a boundary dispute, but left speaking of threats. 3 weeks later he's dead, thrown from his horse on a road he'd traveled 1,000 times. Accidents happen, Mr. Voss, even to experienced riders. Indeed, they do, but when an accident is convenient, people ask questions. The colonel leaned forward. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm investigating. My client has reason to believe that the land sale was made under duress, which would make it invalid. And if the sale was invalid, then the property should revert to the Finch estate. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. Not yet. Voss smiled slightly. But I'm thorough in my research, Colonel. Very thorough. The tension in the room was palpable. Thomas kept his movements careful and quiet, aware that he was witnessing a confrontation that could become dangerous. Later, after the colonel had retired and Voss had gone to his guest room, Thomas made a decision that could cost him his life. He went to the study. The satchel was still there, left behind in the hasty conclusion of the evening's uncomfortable conversation. Thomas's hands were shaking as he opened it. Inside were legal documents, correspondence, a journal, and a small leather-bound notebook. He couldn't read well. He'd learned some letters from a kind overseer's wife years ago before she died, but he could make out some words. He recognized names. Finch, Fairburn, Belmonte. But what stopped his breath was a list in the notebook, names, dates, and the notation whereabouts unknown. He saw Sarah's name, 1842, Marcus, 1839, Eliza, 1840. Others he recognized. Not all 17, but enough. Voss was investigating more than a land dispute. He was investigating disappearances. Thomas carefully returned everything to the satchel exactly as it had been, then slipped out of the study. His mind was racing. Voss was dangerous, but not in the way the colonel was dangerous. Voss was dangerous because he was uncovering truths that would lead to consequences Thomas couldn't predict. The next morning, Thomas was working in the garden when he saw the colonel's personal guard, a man named Hatch, riding toward the eastern boundary. Hatch was returning within an hour, and Thomas noticed mud on his boots from the area near the old spring house. That afternoon, Voss announced he would be concluding his visit the following morning. He seemed satisfied with his survey work, he said, and would be returned to Savannah to file his report. But that night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. The colonel had been too calm at dinner, too agreeable. Voss seemed relieved, almost jovial, Speaking of his forthcoming departure, at midnight, Thomas rose from his bed. He moved through the darkness of the quarters, past the other cabins toward the main house. The plantation was silent, except for the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the distant bark of a dog. A light was burning in the study window. Thomas crept closer, staying in the shadows. Through the window, he could see the colonel at his desk, writing. But what made Thomas's blood run cold was the pistol lying on the desk beside the paper. Thomas stood in the darkness, paralyzed by understanding. The colonel was planning something. Voss would leave in the morning, but would he arrive in Savannah? Or would there be another accident on the road, another unexplained death that would seem like misfortune, but was actually murder? The decision Thomas faced was impossible. He was a slave. He had no legal standing, no authority, no voice that would be heard or believed. If he tried to warn Voss and was caught, he would be killed. Even if he succeeded in warning Voss and Voss escaped, Thomas would be killed for betrayal. There was no version of this story where Thomas survived by acting, but there were 17 graves. 17 people who had been buried in silence because no one had spoken, no one had acted, no one had risked themselves to prevent another death. Thomas thought of the key ring he'd found in the first grave, hidden beneath his floorboard for 19 years. 7 keys. He'd spent years wondering what they opened. Now suddenly he knew where to look. He returned to his cabin and retrieved the keys from their hiding place. Then, moving like a ghost through the night, he went to the main house. The colonel's study had a separate entrance from the side of the house used for business visitors. Thomas tried the first key. It didn't fit. The second key turned in the lock with a quiet click. Inside the study, the colonel had extinguished the lamp and left, but moonlight through the window provided enough illumination to see. Thomas went directly to the large cabinet against the wall, the one he'd seen the colonel lock on countless occasions. The third key opened it. Inside were ledgers. Thomas's reading was limited, but he understood numbers. The ledgers showed payments, expenses, transactions, but there was another column recorded in different ink, names and dates corresponding to special expenditures. He saw Gerard Finch's name with a payment listed beside it, but the payment was dated 1 week after Finch's recorded death. There were other documents, letters, agreements, land deeds, and there at the bottom of the cabinet was a small wooden box. The fifth key opened it. Inside was jewelry, women's jewelry, rings, brooches, a locket. Thomas opened the locket. Inside was a small portrait of a young woman and a lock of hair. The inscription read, "To Eliza with devotion." It was signed with initials. G.F. Gerard Finch had been involved with Eliza, not the colonel's serving woman. Finch's own servant, perhaps, or someone he cared for. And when Finch died, the colonel had acquired not just his land, but also his property, including the people he'd enslaved, including Eliza, and then Eliza had disappeared. The pieces were assembling into a horrifying picture. The colonel hadn't just murdered Finch for his land. He'd murdered anyone who knew about the murder, who might talk, who posed a risk. The special expenditures in the ledger, payments to people who'd helped, or payments to make problems disappear. Thomas was holding evidence of multiple murders spanning 8 years, evidence that could hang the colonel, but evidence that Thomas couldn't bring to any authority because he was property, not a person in the eyes of the law. He heard footsteps in the hallway. Thomas froze. The footsteps paused outside the study door. The handle began to turn. In a moment of pure instinct, Thomas closed the box, closed the cabinet, and dug behind the heavy curtains that covered the window. The door opened. Through a gap in the curtains, Thomas saw the colonel enter carrying a candle. He went directly to the cabinet, opened it with a key from his pocket, and retrieved the wooden box. The colonel stood there looking down at the box with an expression Thomas couldn't fully read, something between regret and resolution. Then he closed the cabinet, turned, and left the study, taking the box with him. Thomas waited, barely breathing, until he was certain the colonel was gone. Then he slipped out from behind the curtain, relocked the cabinet and the study door, and fled back to his cabin. He didn't sleep. He sat on his bed holding the 7 keys, understanding that he'd just witnessed the colonel preparing for another murder. The box probably contained evidence the colonel needed to dispose of before Voss's departure, but it meant the colonel was moving forward with his plan. As dawn approached, Thomas made his decision. Thomas found Voss preparing his horse at first light. The lawyer was packing his satchel into the saddlebags, cheerful and whistling. He seemed oblivious to any danger. "Mr. Voss, sir," Thomas said quietly, approaching from the side. Voss turned, surprised. "Yes." Thomas glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Sir, I need to tell you something. It ain't safe, sir. The road you're taking." Voss's expression changed, becoming sharp and focused. "What do you mean?" "There's danger, sir. I can't say more, but you shouldn't take the main road. You should go a different way." "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas met his eyes directly. "A breach of every social code. Because there's already too many people buried on this property, sir. I don't want to know where another one is." Voss stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "I see. There's a back road, sir, through the Miller property to the east. It's longer, but it'll take you to the main route to Savannah, without going to the woods where the road gets lonely." "Thank you." Voss reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. He wrote something quickly, then folded it. "If anything happens to me, if I don't reach Savannah, this needs to get to the sheriff in Augusta. Can you see that it does? I can't leave the property, sir. I understand, but perhaps it could be placed where someone passing to might find it, someone who could deliver it." Thomas took the folded paper. Understanding, there were peddlers, traveling preachers, people who moved between plantations. "I'll see what I can do, sir. What's your name?" "Thomas, sir. Thomas Hale." Voss studied him carefully. "You're a brave man, Thomas Hale. Much braver than most. I'm just tired counting graves, sir." After Voss departed, taking the alternate route, Thomas went about his assigned work, but his nerves were stretched taut. Would the colonel discover that Voss had changed routes? Would he realize Thomas had warned him? The day passed with agonizing slowness. The colonel was in a foul mood, snapping at everyone, pacing the house. By afternoon, it became clear why. A rider had returned from the main road with news. Vase had not been seen on the expected route. The plan, whatever it had been, had failed. The colonel's eyes swept across the plantation with cold calculation. Thomas knew that look. It was the look that preceded someone disappearing. That night, Hatch came to Thomas's cabin. "Colonel wants to see you. Main house now." Thomas followed, his mouth dry. This was it. The colonel had figured it out. In the study, the colonel sat behind his desk, the pistol once again lying beside his hand. The message was clear. "Thomas," the colonel said, his voice deceptively calm, "you've been at Belmont 1 for a long time." "Yes, sir." "You've seen a lot, heard a lot." "I don't hear nothing, sir. I don't see nothing. That ain't my business. That's what I've always appreciated about you, Thomas. Your discretion." The colonel picked up the pistol, not aiming it, just holding it. "Mr. Voss asked you questions when you accompanied him to the boundary, didn't he? Just about the property, sir, about measurements and such. Did he ask you about people who used to be here? People who left?" "No, sir." The lie was enormous, filling the room. The colonel studied Thomas's face, looking for any sign of deception. Thomas kept his expression carefully blank, the mask he'd worn for 19 years. "I wonder," the colonel said softly, "how Mr. Vass knew to change his route this morning. I wonder who might have suggested he take the back road instead of the main road where he paused, where the road can be treacherous." Thomas said nothing. "You're a valuable asset. Thomas, you know this plantation better than anyone. Every acre, every building, the colonel smiled coldly, every piece of earth that's been disturbed and then smoothed over. Don't you?" It was the first time the colonel had come close to acknowledging what Thomas knew. The admission was itself a death sentence. If the colonel was speaking of it openly, it meant he decided Thomas couldn't be allowed to live with that knowledge. "I just know where I've been told to dig, sir, where I've been told to work." "Yes, you've done a lot of digging over the years." The colonel stood walking around the desk to stand close to Thomas. "Too close. I think it's time we found a new position for you. Tomorrow morning, I'm sending you south. I've already arranged the sale. You'll be transported to a plantation in Mississippi. Soul South, the euphemism for disappearance. Yes, sir, Thomas said quietly. You'll leave at dawn. Hatch will accompany you to the trader station in Augusta. Get your affairs in order tonight. Thomas was dismissed. He walked back to his cabin, his mind racing. He wasn't going to make it to Augusta. Somewhere on that road, there would be an accident. Maybe he'd try to run. Maybe he'd attack Hatch. The story would be told, and Thomas Hale would become the 18th grave. But Thomas had one advantage. He knew it was coming. Thomas didn't sleep. He sat in his cabin, and he made a map. He couldn't write well, but he could draw. On a piece of cloth torn from his blanket, using charcoal from the fire, he marked 17 locations on a crude sketch of Belmonte Plantation. Each location he marked with an X and named the names of the people buried there. Then he wrote laboriously in letters he taught himself. The earth remembers Thomas Hale, 1847. He wrapped the cloth around Voss's folded note and placed them both in a small tin box. Then he went to Isaiah's cabin. The old man was awake, sitting by his fire. They're sending you away, Isaiah said. It wasn't a question. Yes, you ain't coming back. No. Isaiah nodded slowly. What do you need? Thomas handed him the tin box. When the peddler comes next week, the one who trades at the Miller place, get this to him. Tell him it needs to reach the sheriff in Augusta. Thomas, I know what I'm asking. But Isaiah, if nothing changes, if no one speaks, this will keep happening. More graves, more names. There's 17 now. I'll be 18. How many more after that? Isaiah took the box, his weathered hands trembling slightly. They'll kill me, too, if they find out. I know. I'm sorry, but you're old. You got less time to lose than most. And maybe, Thomas swallowed hard, maybe we can't change nothing. Maybe this all gets buried like everything else. But at least we tried. At least someone spoke. Isaiah looked at the box, then at Thomas. My son was Marcus. Did you know that? Thomas felt his heart contract. Marcus, accused of theft, disappeared in 1839, one of 17. I knew, Thomas whispered. That's why I counted. That's why I remembered, because they wanted everyone to forget, and I couldn't let that happen. Where is he? Beneath the tobacco barn, north corner. Isaiah closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his weathered cheek. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for remembering his name. They sat together in silence for a long moment. Two men who had lost everything, but somehow still had something left to give. At dawn, Thomas stood in front of his cabin with nothing but the clothes on his back. Hatch sat on his horse, a rifle across his saddle. Another man, a trader named Simmons, waited with a wagon. They bound Thomas's hands, not unusual for transported slaves, and loaded him into the wagon. Hatch rode beside them as they left Belmonte Plantation. The road to Augusta would take most of the day. Thomas watched the landscape pass, memorizing it, the pine forests, the red clay roads, the morning mist rising from the lands. He'd spent 19 years at Belmonte, rarely leaving the property. Now, in what would likely be his final journey, he saw Georgia as a free person might, as a place of beauty, despite the ugliness of what happened within it. They stopped at midday to water the horses. Simmons walked away to relieve himself. Hatch dismounted, approaching the wagon. You seem calm, Hatch observed. Most slaves being transported are either crying or plotting. No point in either, Thomas said. Hatch smiled. Smart. I like that about you, Thomas. You accept reality. He lit a cigarette studying Thomas. The colonel said, You've been talking to people, asking questions. I haven't asked nobody nothing. That's good because questions are dangerous. People who ask questions about Belmonte tend to leave Belmonte, if you understand my meaning. Thomas understood perfectly. You've been the one doing the colonel's dirty work for a long time, haven't you? Hatch's smile faded. Careful now. 17 people. That's a lot of graves to dig. Hatch stepped closer, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. How do you know about? He stopped, realizing he'd just confirmed what Thomas had said. I know because I found them. Every single one. I know where they are, who they were when they died. then you're a fool for still being alive. That kind of knowledge gets you killed. I'm already dead. You ain't taking me to Augusta. You're taking me to a quiet place on this road where I'll try to escape, and you'll shoot me. And that'll be the end of Thomas Hale. Hatch didn't deny it. If you know that, why are you here? Why didn't you run during the night? Because running just means getting caught and proving I was guilty of something. This way, when I'm gone, people will know I didn't run. I didn't fight. I just disappeared like all the others. And maybe eventually someone will ask why so many people disappear from Belmonte. No one will ask. No one cares about slaves disappearing. Maybe, but that lawyer cared. And he ain't the only one who's going to start asking questions. Simmons returned, and they resumed the journey. As the afternoon wore on, they entered a stretch of road bordered by deep forest. Hatch called for a stop. Need to check the wagon wheel. He announced, "Thomas, get down. I need you to help lift it." Thomas climbed down, his bound hands making the movement awkward. This was it. This was where it would happen. Hatch positioned Thomas near the back of the wagon away from Simmons. The trader was checking horses, not paying attention. Hatch's hand moved to his pistol. Nothing personal. Hatch said quietly, just business. But before he could draw the weapon, there was a sound from the forest. Riders approaching. Hatch's hand froze. 3 men emerged from the trees, and Thomas's heart leaped. One of them was Edmund Voss. "I wouldn't do that," Voss said calmly, his own pistol already drawn and aimed at Hatch. With Voss were 2 other men, a sheriff's deputy, and another man Thomas didn't recognize. "What's this about?" Simmons demanded, walking forward. "This," Voss said, "is an arrest." "Mr. Hatch, you're being detained for questioning regarding the murder of Gerard Finch and others." Hatch's face went white. "You can't. I'm transporting this slave." "You're not transporting anyone anywhere. Deputy, secure him." The deputy moved forward with shackles. Hatch looked wildly between them, then at Thomas, hatred burning in his eyes. You told him." "I warned him," Thomas said simply. "That's all I did." Voss dismounted and approached Thomas, cutting the rope binding his hands. "I'm sorry for the deception, Thomas. I needed to know if the colonel would attempt to silence you, as we suspected he would." Thomas rubbed his wrists. "I haven't been entirely honest about my purpose here. Yes, I'm investigating the Finch land transfer, but I've also been investigating Belmonte on behalf of several families whose relatives disappeared after being enslaved there. Your warning saved my life, but also confirmed our suspicions." The 3rd man stepped forward. "Thomas Hale, my name is William Chun. I'm a journalist from Boston. I've been documenting cases of suspected murders disguised as slave sales and escapes. Your information could break this story open." Thomas felt dizzy. This was not an ending he'd imagined. "Isaiah, the man I gave the map to. He's safe." Voss assured him. "We collected the tin box this morning. The map you made, the names, the locations, they corroborate everything we've been piecing together. What happens now?" "Now," Voss said grimly, "we exhume the graves, every single one you've documented, and we bring charges against Colonel Fairburn for murder. The exhumation took 3 days. Thomas led the authorities to each location, watching as 17 graves yielded 17 sets of remains. Some were slave, some were free black people who disappeared, and one Gerard Finch was a white landowner. The physical evidence was damning. Several skulls showed signs of trauma. Clothing fragments, personal effects, and jewelry were recovered, items that could be traced to missing persons. In Gerard Finch's grave, they found a cyanate ring that his nephew identified immediately. Colonel William Fairburn was arrested on the 2nd day of excavation. He maintained his innocence, insisting that he knew nothing about any graves, that slaves ran away all the time, that Finch's death had been an accident. But the ledger from the colonel's study, retrieved with Thomas's key, showed the pattern of payments and dates. Hatch, facing the gallows himself, agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. He detailed 8 years of murders, explaining how slaves who learned too much or who might testify about other crimes were systematically eliminated. Finch had been murdered because he'd threatened to expose the colonel's fraud in a separate land deal. Eliza had been killed because she'd been Finch's informant. The trial took place in Augusta in October of 1847. It was sensational. A wealthy plantation owner accused of multiple murders, including that of a white landowner. William Chen's newspaper articles had spread the story across the nation, making it impossible to suppress or dismiss. Thomas testified, standing in a courtroom. Speaking his truth to white men who had power over life and death was the most terrifying thing he'd ever done. But he spoke clearly, methodically, describing each grave, each person, each piece of evidence he'd quietly cataloged over 19 years. The defense attorney tried to discredit him, arguing that a slave's testimony was unreliable, that Thomas might be motivated by revenge or fantasy. But the physical evidence supported every claim Thomas made. The graves were where he said they were. The remains matched the descriptions. The timeline aligned with the disappearances. On November 3, 1847, Colonel William Fairburn was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to hang. The verdict sent shock waves through Georgia's plantation society. If a wealthy white plantation owner could be convicted based partly on slave testimony and forensic evidence, what other secrets might the earth be hiding? Thomas stood in the cemetery at Belmonte on a cold December morning. 17 graves now marked with proper stones. The names of the dead finally acknowledged. Sarah, Marcus, Eliza, Gerard Finch, all the others who had been buried in secret. Their lives erased from memory. The enslaved people of Belmonte had been dispersed, sold to pay the colonel's debts and legal fees. Isaiah had been purchased by a Quaker family in Pennsylvania who believed in gradual emancipation. They'd offered to purchase Thomas as well to manumit him, but the legal complications were still being untangled. Edmund Voss approached, standing beside Thomas at the graves. The nephew is taking possession of the property, Finch's property and Belmonte both. He's decided to sell Belmonte entirely, wants nothing to do with it. What about the people still here? Thomas asked. He's agreed to sell them only to families committed to eventual manumission. It's not freedom, but it's something. Thomas nodded slowly. And me? You're being granted your freedom as a reward for your testimony. The paperwork will be finalized next week. Voss paused. I'm sorry it's framed as a reward rather than simple justice, but that's the system we have. I'll be free, Thomas said quietly, as if testing the word. What will you do? Thomas looked at the 17 graves. I've been thinking about that all those years. I was counting graves because I couldn't save lives, couldn't stop what was happening, couldn't speak. But now he turned to Voss. Mr. Chun, the journalist, said he wants to write more stories about other plantations, other missing people. He does. He's asked for your help. Actually, I'll do it. I'll go to other plantations and look for what's hidden. I'll speak for people who can't speak. I'll count graves until there ain't no more graves to count. It's dangerous work. I've been living dangerous for 19 years. At least now I'll be dangerous for a purpose. Voss smiled slightly. You know, when I first met you, I saw a man who kept his eyes down and his mouth shut. I didn't realize I was meeting the bravest person I'd ever encounter. I ain't brave. I was just tired of being silent. William Chin joined them carrying a leather notebook. Thomas, I've been thinking about how to tell this story. It's not just about the murders or the trial. It's about memory. About how you remembered when everyone else forgot. How you marked the locations of the disappeared. I just did what needed doing. No, Chin said firmly. You did what almost no one would have the courage to do. You documented atrocity when documentation could get you killed. And because you did, justice was possible. Thomas looked at the 17 stones. It ain't enough. Justice for these 17 don't change the system that killed them. Don't free the thousands still enslaved. Don't stop the next colonel at the next plantation. No, Chin agreed, but it's a start. And every story we tell, every grave we mark, every name we remember, it's a crack in the foundation. Enough cracks, and maybe the whole structure falls. Thomas Hale's Freedom Papers were finalized on December 15, 1847. He was 31 years old, and for the first time in his life, he legally owned himself. Over the next 13 years, he worked with William Chun and other abolitionists, traveling to plantations across the South, investigating suspicious disappearances, documenting hidden graves. His testimony helped prosecute 3 other plantation owners and expose the systematic murder of enslaved people who knew too much or who threatened their owners' interests. His work made him a target. He survived 2 assassination attempts, one beating that left with a permanent limp and constant threats. But he continued, driven by the memory of 17 graves and conviction that silence was complicity. When the Civil War began in 1861, Thomas joined the Union Army, serving as a scout and intelligence gatherer. His intimate knowledge of plantation geography and his ability to read landscapes, to see what was hidden, made him invaluable. The war ended slavery, but didn't end Thomas's work. In the Reconstruction period, he helped freedmen locate the graves of family members who had died in bondage, marking sites, preserving memory, ensuring that the disappeared were not forgotten. Thomas Hale died in 1889 at the age of 73. He was buried in a small cemetery in Augusta, Georgia. His headstone, simple and plain, bore an inscription he had requested, "Here remembered." But beneath that inscription, added by those who knew his story, were the words in memory of the 17 and all the countless others. The Belmont Plantation was never rebuilt. The land was divided and sold off. The main house, left empty, gradually collapsed. By the early 1900s, nothing remained except the 17 marked graves and the foundations of buildings that had hidden terrible secrets. But the story lived on. William Chen's articles published in abolitionist newspapers preserved Thomas's testimony. Later, historians would cite the Belmont case as crucial evidence of the extent to which slavery depended not just on labor extraction, but on terror, disappearance, and murder. The 17 graves became a memorial site, visited by those who wanted to remember what had been done, what had been hidden, and what one man's courage had brought to light. Because Thomas Hale had done something extraordinary. He had looked at the ground and seen not just dirt, but people. He had walked a plantation for 19 years and carried an invisible map of the dead, keeping their names alive in his memory when all official record had erased them. He had been a witness when witnessing meant death. He had spoken when speech was forbidden. He had remembered when remembering was an act of rebellion. And in the end, the earth did what Thomas always knew it would. It gave up its secrets. It testified to what had been buried. It confirmed that some truths, no matter how deep you bury them, will eventually surface. Thomas Hale knew every hidden grave on Belmont Plantation because he refused to look away. And because he refused to look away, 17 names were returned from the anonymous earth to the light of acknowledgement. The graves were marked. The names were spoken. The dead were remembered. And Thomas Hale, the slave who became a witness, who became a voice, who became a memorial himself, ensured that the disappeared would never fully disappear, that the forgotten would be remembered, that the earth would speak its truth. In that small Georgia cemetery, beneath the words he remembered, lies a man who understood that memory is resistance, that naming is power, that bearing witness, even at the cost of everything, is perhaps the most human thing we can do. The 17 graves at Belmonte stand as testament, not just to the lives that were taken, but to the one life that refused to forget. Join the Fear Ledger and uncover the secrets history tried to erase. Subscribe now